Still to come on breakfast, it's been called the nation's favourite novel. Today marks the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
So David Silito has been to the author's home in Hampshire to find out why her book has had such a lasting appeal. Morning, David.
Good morning. Let me conjure you a little scene. Exactly here, 200 years ago, Jane Austen would have walked through with this book, taking delivery of it. This is where Jane would have been practicing the piano. Becky's doing it for us today. And this is where Jane would have read to Miss Benn aloud the book, not even letting on that she had written it. I've got so much to tell you. But before that, the news, travel and weather, where you are today.
Still to come on breakfast this morning, it's been called the nation's favourite novel, and today marks the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
David Silito is at the author's home in Hampshire finding out why her book has had such a lasting appeal. Morning, David.
We're conjuring a little scene from history for you today. This is exactly where Jane Austen would have been standing 200 years ago. It's Isabel playing the role here for us today, and she would have walked up and taken receipt of the first edition of Pride and Prejudice. And this is where Becky is standing in for Jane today. She would have practiced the piano. There is so much to say. 200 years of Pride and Prejudice. But before that, the news, travel and weather, where you are today.
Here on Breakfast, it's been called the nation's favourite novel, and today marks the 200th anniversary of the publication of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
David Silito is at the author's home in Hampshire. Morning, David.
Good morning, Becky. Please take it away. Becky is being Jane Austen for us this morning in exactly the place where Jane Austen would have played the piano. And here she would have this evening, 200 years ago, been reading the first published edition of Pride and Prejudice. So much to say, but before that, the news, travel and weather, where you are today.
It was a book Jane Austen described as her own darling child. Well, now that child, Pride and Prejudice, as we know it, is 200 years old.
First published in 1813, the novel sells up to 50,000 copies every year in the UK. What is the secret, then, of its enduring appeal?
Who better to investigate than our arts correspondent David Silito, who is searching for answers at Jane Austen's House Museum in Hampshire. Morning.
Good morning, and what's more, we've created a little scene for you. Jane Austen has joined us this morning while Isabel is being Jane Austen, and this is actually Jane's writing desk, isn't it? Well, and this is a little parcel we've concocted because there would have been a knock at the door 200 years ago. This would have arrived. What was it? The first edition of Pride and Prejudice, an extraordinary literary moment we're celebrating today. And many people are not just reading it, they're also writing. And we're asking a question: why are so many people themselves having a go at writing about Miss Bennet and, of course, Mr. Darcy?
As you can see, I'm a bit obsessed with Jane Austen.
Obsessed?
Yes.
Mr. Darcy's Secret is one of yours.
Yes,
You've written
that's
others
right.
as well.
Yes, that's right.
And you're not the only person doing this, are you?
No, this is a very good friend of mine, Victoria Connolly.
With Mr. Darcy, Darcy's Diary.
Darcy's Diary.
This is another Darcy-related story
That's
here.
right. And Monica Fairview, who's written Darcy Cousins.
Darcy, Darcy, Darcy.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's Mr. Darcy is the biggest draw, I think. And to be perfectly honest, I think that all started with the 1995 adaptation with Colin Firth.
The Wet Shirt.
The Wet Shirt, yes.
It was a moment that inspired a new industry. Abigail Reynolds, Pamela Aden, Jan Hahn. It wasn't just Lizzie Bennet's heart that was sent aflutter.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Bennet.
Among my books are Mr. Darcy's Obsession.
These are the Simon & Schuster versions of the books.
I want to relive Elizabeth falling in love with Darcy over and over again.
Now, incredible output, but you are taking on the mantle
of possibly one of the greatest writers in the English
Yes.
language.
Yes, I think I am brave to do that. I can't claim to be Jane Austen, and I could never, ever emulate her.
You do this because you love doing it.
I do it because I love it, yes.
And I'm joined now by Professor John Mullen of University College. You have written a great deal about Jane Austen. Is it her best book? Is it the one that we should all read?
Well, it's the one to start with, definitely, and it's the one which, it's her second novel, and it's definitely the one which, from its very first sentence, you think, now here's a genius, here's somebody who really knows what they're doing.
Is it that good, or is it just the fame it's acquired because people talk about it?
It's absolutely that good, and actually I think all the talk and adaptation, I think a lot of people would be surprised or surprised whether they've read it before or not to open it again and remember that actually, you know, it's not Andrew Davis and it's not Keira Knightley, it's actually, there's something there really extraordinary.
Do you find that anyone could pick it up and get the jokes, understand it? Because it's 200 years ago she started writing about it.
Absolutely. I mean, extraordinary. It's an incredible sort of mix of simplicity and complexity. That's the thing. So you can read any of the sentences, you can work out what anybody's saying, and yet the psychological complexity that's incredible. So it's a book to read whether you're 16 or you're 60.
And essentially it's Cinderella, isn't it? She gets her man, Prince Charming, in the end.
I think it's a bit more interesting than that. It's a story about love between people who don't know their own minds, which is an incredibly common, ordinary, but very, very difficult thing to do in a novel.
John Mullen, thank you very much indeed. And we are standing here at the exact point where she would, this evening, 200 years ago, have first read it to a neighbour without even letting on that she had written it.
Jane Austen described as her own darling child. Now that child, Pride and Prejudice, is 200 years old.
First published back in 1813, the novel sells up to 50,000 copies each year. So what is the secret of its enduring appeal in the UK?
Well, our arts correspondent David Silto has been searching for answers at Jane Austen's House Museum in Hampshire with Jane herself. Morning.
It's not often you can start the day with Jane Austen, is it? Well, this is Isabel being Jane Austen for me, but this is her writing desk, isn't it? Extraordinary, because this is the exact place where 200 years ago there would have been a delivery of a 3-volume novel, the first edition of Pride and Prejudice. An extraordinary moment. 200 years on, well, all sorts of people are having a go at reimagining Jane Austen. Joanna Trollope joins me now. You are doing something with Sense and Sensibility, aren't you?
I am. I have. It's delivered. It's something called the Austen Project, where 6 contemporary writers are going to write 2013 versions of the 6 novels. And of course, today being the 200th birthday of the publication of Pride and Prejudice, it is exactly 200 years.
So you're taking the characters, you're taking these
Exactly.
extraordinary characters,
Yeah.
untouchables of English literature.
Exactly. Isn't it bold?
And playing around with them.
Well, playing around with them in a way, because I've written a Joanna Trollope novel, but it is exactly Jane's characters and exactly the narrative of Sense and Sensibility.
Do they translate to the 21st century?
Perfectly. All the people do. I mean, obviously, Willoughby has to have an Aston Martin, not a horse. And the terrible scene in which he rejects Marianne publicly, somebody will film on their iPhone. But, you know, the story itself, that the people stand up to translation down the ages absolutely superbly.
So many people, though, have experienced Jane Austen through television, and it's sort of like
Yes.
Cinderella, isn't it, almost, to them? It's sort of romance and romantic fiction. There's something a bit grittier, is there?
Much grittier. And this particular novel, Pride and Prejudice, today, the birthday, the 200th birthday of Pride and Prejudice, in a way, marvellous though some of the films have been, and delightful and lovely and romantic, they've done the novel a bit of a disservice because it's such a much meatier book than that. It really, really is. And it is about husband hunting, of course it is. But it's actually for a very powerful and muscular reason, which is that women then were, well, I think, rather wretchedly, entirely dependent upon men for their livelihood.
It was money or destitution.
It was. And David, the point is, it is destitution. It's not poverty, it's destitution. You fell from the heights of Pemberley into the gutter.
Joanna Trollope, thank you very much indeed. And you've got to remember, it was in this house that she would have actually read Pride and Prejudice aloud to her neighbour Miss Benn, not letting on, of course, that she'd actually written the book herself.
Well, I hope Miss Benn liked it. Otherwise, that would be terribly upsetting for her. David,
she actually
yes?
wanted it to be read in the special voices. She complained later on when her mother started reading it to her, and she said Jane Austen read it better.
Ah, yes. Oh, good. David, thanks very much. Yes, a book that Jane Austen described as her own darling child, and that child, Pride and Prejudice, is now 200 years old.
First published in 1813, the novel still sells up to 50,000 copies every year in the UK alone. What is the secret, then, of its enduring appeal?
Our arts correspondent David Sinato is looking for those answers at Jane Austen's House Museum in Hampshire this morning. Morning, David.
Good morning. Here's the house, and we're going to recreate a little bit of history for you. There would have been someone looking not dissimilar to this, making a delivery, a parcel exactly this size. We're pretty certain about that. And we'd have walked in here, and who would have been sitting here but, yes, Jane Austen herself. Well, this is Isabel, in the style of Jane Austen. Let me make the little presentation to you there. And this is the desk that she actually did some of her writing at. And this is all about, well, what was appearing in that particular little parcel this morning. She took delivery of something that she had begun writing in 1796, and finally, there it is, the 3 volumes of Pride and Prejudice. And the question is, 200 years on, it's not just Jane Austen who's writing about Pride and Prejudice. 185 sequels and spin-offs. Why is it that so many people are fascinated by Mr. Darcy?
As you can see, I'm a bit obsessed with Jane Austen.
Obsessed?
Yes.
Mr. Darcy's Secret is one of yours.
Yes,
You've written
that's
others
right.
as well.
Yes, that's right.
And you're not the only person doing this, are you?
No, this is a very good friend of mine, Victoria
A weekend
Connolly.
with Mr. Darcy. Darcy.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Mr. Darcy is the biggest draw, I think. And to be perfectly honest, I think that all started with the 1995 adaptation with Colin Firth.
The Wet Shirt.
The Wet Shirt, yes.
It was a moment that inspired a new industry. Abigail Reynolds, Pamela Aden, Jan Hahn. It wasn't just Lizzie Bennet's heart that was sent aflutter.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Bennet?
Among my books are Mr. Darcy's Obsession.
These are the Simon & Schuster versions of the books.
I want to relive Elizabeth falling in love with Darcy over and over again.
I can't claim to be Jane Austen, and I could never, ever emulate her.
You do this because you love doing it.
I do it because I love it, yes.
Well, I feel rather privileged here because I'm actually holding one of those original first edition Pride and Prejudice there, 1813, a novel in 3 volumes by the author of Sense and Sensibility, because of course Jane Austen didn't actually have her name written on the book. And to mark it, if we have a little look down here, there it is. They've done a cake, an extraordinary cake by the local Simon's Butchers, by bakers I should say, and this is the house, the room where she would have actually read Pride and Prejudice on that evening to Miss Benn, one of her neighbours, and would have then gone all the voices, that famous opening sentence, but of course not revealed to Miss Benn that it was she, Jane Austen, who had written the book. An extraordinary little bit of history, and here it is, 200 years on, we're all here still reading the book, and of course all those people still writing their own versions.